Good evening and welcome to our first event for the 2024 Wellspring series. My name is Leslie Barnes and I am an associate professor of French at the ANU. I'm also the head of the Wellspring initiative on the ANU side. Wellspring is a collaboration between the ANU School of Literature, Languages and Linguistics and the Street Theatre. And the idea was to come together and create opportunities for dialogue and exchange with the wider Canberra community on topics in the arts and the humanities. And we have a fantastic lineup for you this year. In addition to tonight's event, we have next month on May 16th, Bushfire Stories, which looks at the power of language and the power of storytelling to create community in times of devastation. Then on July 4th, We've Been Here, which is an exploration of Italian folklore and gender and ethnic identity in an experimental one-person performance. And then in August, on the 15th, we've got Latin Thrills, which takes the film thriller genre as a way into talking about Latin American politics and history. But tonight, it's Memory in the City, and so I will hand over now to my colleague Ann-Sophie Levidis, who is a lecturer in French at the ANU. She is a scholar of history and international law, and she's also the brains behind tonight's event, and she'll be moderating the discussion. So thank you for coming, welcome, and please help me to welcome Ann-Sophie.
Thank you, Leslie, for the introduction. Thank you to the Wellspring event to accept to have welcome this event. Thank you for André for coming here. And so what does it mean to know the past? And how is it that the past is so often intimately tied to a particular place? The workings of memory, which give meaning, also betray us, confound our purposes, stretching the edges and dissolving the boundary between past and present. There is a tension between memory and history, between what we know and what the archival record and arrange into historical meaning for posterity. There is an elusiveness to what we remember, to the stories that populate and haunt our lives. Have you ever noticed how memory slips the bound of place until the landscape of the past, cities and streets, dissolve into one imaginary realm that is all cities and all time at once? But to live lives of centuries, to leap across times, to have conversation that in life we were too cowardly to have with each other. Such is the promises of the written world. So tonight I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here at the Street Theatre, including the four panelists. And let me introduce tonight's event, Memory in the City. The event aims to explore collective memories in cities with a focus on the history of Vietnam. The four panelists will delve into topics such as Vietnam, collective memory, and the transformation of cities at the Street Theatre. First, we have a renowned author, André, who is also a Melbourne-based legal academic, and he is the author of a much acclaimed book, Anam. In his book, Dao shares his experience about his Vietnamese heritage and how the war divided his family and country. Then we have Leslie sitting here, and thank you for the introduction, who is, as she said, an associate professor of French history at ANU. Leslie has lived in Hanoi, and Hanoi, as she said, was the gateway not only to her career, but also, I think, to a part of her life. Then we have here, sitting here, Damon Manderson, who is a well-known professor of law at the ANU, and he has really helped to change our understanding of legal imaginaries. And he has also helped to rethink how colonial imaginaries has transformed Vietnam. So thank you so much. And André, please join me to start with the reading.
I am going to begin at the beginning of my novel, Anam. C. If I think of my grandparents now, after all this writing and reading and imagining and remembering, two couples are thrown into relief, their outlines like clay figures in the mud where so many others are failing to resist the ebb and flow of forgetting. Both couples are elderly and Vietnamese and live in an apartment outside Paris with their eldest daughter. Both couples have been together 60 years through 2 wars and many separations. Both speak to me in a mix of Vietnamese, French, and a smattering of English. But one couple speak to me of suffering, loss, exile, forgiveness, and redemption, and the other couple do not. Instead, they are always laughing, with each other and at me, pinching, touching, feeding me, looking at me, shaking their heads and chastising me, praising my plumpness and my height and my grades. This second couple is harder to write, but easier to remember. I think of them as saying to me over and over again, "We want you to be." And also, "Why don't you marry that poor girl?" And "When are you taking the bar exam?" And always, "Eat up. Why aren't you eating? Finished already?" I've been trying for a long time to bring the two couples together in my mind, or at least to avoid having to choose between them. And just now, thinking of them, I remember the visit that my grandmother and I paid to my grandfather one late afternoon when he was on his deathbed. He was in a clean beige room in a public hospital a train and a bus away from their daughter's apartment. He patted the side of the bed for my grandmother to come sit by him, and I asked them once again about the story, expecting them to tell me the usual things. Instead, they chose to sing, something they had never done before and would never do again, an old jazz standard, "I Remember You." But even as I was fumbling to record them on my phone, they were already finishing, lapsing into wrinkled smiles, so that the recording I have is nothing but silence. This will be the last time that I will have begun again. The last because I will have learnt to see what I failed to see at the beginning. I will have learnt to see that a muddy swamp can be called a fen, that not knowing where you're going can be a virtue, and that walking is a kind of perfection. I will have learnt to see that the dilapidated rental we left behind in Footscray will always be the house where we first bathed our daughter, washing off the blood and muck with which she arrived. And I will have learnt that after Cambridge, we will return to that house in Footscray after all, and that, in time, it will also be where we first bathe our son, washing off the blood and muck with which he arrives. I will have learnt that the robes we matriculated in at Cambridge, hired from the college's Graduate Student Association, were actually cheap polyester, that most of the books in the many libraries in which I will have sat have never and will never be read, and that the past is no more a home than any of the string of place names with which my family is entangled could be a home. Hum Sa, Hanoi, Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, Lyon, Paris, Boissy, Cambridge, Footscray. I will have learnt that we walk, as Paul said, by faith and not by sight. I will have learnt to stop stopping, that is, to stop waiting while stopped. I will have learnt, instead, to wait while walking, to walk without expectation of arriving, and yet still be ready to arrive at any moment. In the end, I will have learnt, or remembered if there's any difference, how to live. Or at least, I will have learnt what we receive from our ancestors and what we pass on to our children, what we give them, even as we wash away the blood and muck with which they arrived.
Thank you for this reading. It has been really very interesting. In your reading, you speak about ancestor, and your book is really you are trying to pay tribute to your ancestors, to the Vietnamese, to your Vietnamese heritage, and you really delve into the universal themes of identity and human understanding. In your book, you make clear how your grandfather, Catholic intellectual and lawyer in Vietnam, was imprisoned without any trial for 10 years in communist Vietnam. And at the same time, you also reveal that some of your relatives were supporting the communist regime. After his release, your grandfather fled to France, where your family already escaped. Your father was in France, and your mother, which were the boat people, had fled to Australia. This experience has really given you a unique perspective on home and belonging, and we can really see in the reading, in your reading. But I wanted to ask you, how did you seek to unravel the mysteries surrounding Vietnam and surrounding the history of your grandfather? How did you explore the different the different perspectives of your relatives and the myth and stories surrounding the country?
Thank you, Ann-Sophie. So in a way, I mean, that beginning that I just read out, it begins with this line about feeling like you have to choose between these two different versions of one's grandparents. And I think what I wanted to get across there was the sense that the kind of memory work that's involved in writing a book like this does involve sort of an endless series of these choices. And, that was something that I slowly came to realize as I was writing this book. So it took me about 10 years of working on this book, and when I began writing it, I didn't think of it in terms of choices. I thought it was a simple thing that I was doing. So I discovered as a teenager this sort of semi-secret in the family that my grandfather had been imprisoned in Vietnam, as you said, without charge or trial. And from that point on, I knew that I wanted to write about it, and I thought, naively, I could just go and ask my grandfather. He'd tell me the story, and I'd write it down. And of course, it didn't work like that at all. I did go to Paris to speak to him, and what he wanted to talk to me about was wholly different from what I wanted to ask him. And so that was already the first sort of, the gap sort of enlarging. And I think it took me a long time to come to grips with that, because I thought what I was doing was trying to bring us closer together, and it seemed with every question I was making this chasm even wider. So how I went about it, partly it was just through a series of failures. So this first version of the book, that simple, naive version, failed. It didn't do what I needed it to do. And so I kept trying different approaches, and the one that I've landed on with Anam is this sort of fictionalized, novelized, and yet quite true in some ways book.
Thank you. My second question is about, you are mentioning Footscray. And so you grew up in Footscray, Melbourne, and you have also developed, so you said in interview, a strong sense of belonging to the area, which also has a rich history. And as we discussed today earlier, you said to me something which has me something very important. You said earlier today that the sense of belonging to the Vietnamese community in Melbourne is fractured, and it's fractured along the lines of the history of migration. And this really reflects the experience I had when I was interviewing Vietnamese migrants in Germany. So, and in Germany, as I told you, I interview many former boat people who had escaped from Saigon, from the shores of Saigon, and they arrived in Europe, and they were very thankful to the country, to Germany, to welcome them, and they had like a kind of resentment. And on the other hand, as Germany was divided, after in the late 70s, the German government, the German Eastern government, welcomed thousands of migrants from communist Vietnam, and they work in Germany as workers. After the wall fell, it's some of the Vietnamese migrants remain, and they still live there. But it is quite amazing when you conduct interviews also in former East Germany. The wall is still there. The communities refuse to speak to each other, and especially the boat people generation, they really has a sense of resentment, and they say it's not the same Vietnam. So how does this experience reflect your own history? And what about Footscray and Melbourne? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar, Footscray is a suburb of inner western Melbourne, and so that's where my mother was first resettled when she arrived in Australia in the early 1980s. And so Footscray, I guess, not unlike many other inner city suburbs around Australia, has had this sort of history of waves of migration, if you like. And so in the 70s and 80s, the Footscray became this sort of heavily Vietnamese suburb, and to the extent now that, you know, that sort of the main shopping strip there, you go down there and it's full of these Vietnamese shops. Just recently, one that was there until just recently was one of those strange stores that sold only bootleg DVDs of sort of Vietnamese movies. So it's that kind of place. Now, what was interesting about living there more recently was that, so you have this older Vietnamese community, the community that I've come from, that my mother comes from, you know, the so-called boat people, and they've established businesses. They run a kind of local community association. They have a presence in the local primary school. But in recent years, there's been international students from Vietnam moving into the suburb because, you know, relatively cheap rent and proximity to some of Melbourne's unis. And the young students coming from Vietnam largely don't know or don't particularly care about the history of the war, but the local established community, that's really the memory of that war is the kind of the glue that holds them together. And I remember being struck by the fact that when I'd leave our house in Footscray, I turned the corner and there was the local RSL flew the Australian flag and it flew the South Vietnamese flag. So, and the extraordinary thing, I suppose, so visually that sort of struck me, is that the flag of this country that's gone is flying outside the RSL. But the extraordinary and really frustrating thing was when opportunities for kind of intercultural exchange came up with the primary school. People said, oh, there's lots of Vietnamese children at this school. We should have a sister school in Vietnam. And the local community, the people who still were prosecuting this war in their memories, said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with that, the current government. And I know that you're getting the hurry up, so I'll stop it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering my two questions. Thank you.
I guess the background structure of this event, in case it's not clear, is so it began with a reading. So we're moving sort of through the different places that the novel moves through. So beginning with Melbourne or Footscray, but this next reading will take us to Hanoi, which is where the narrator's grandparents grew up. And so this reading comes from towards the middle of the book, and the narrator has travelled to Hanoi in the hopes of doing some research into his family history. But he's struggling to make sense of what he's found out. 3. The faint hint of frangipani's wafts into the library on some unknown, possibly quite imaginary draft. Yes, that will do. That scent, sickly sweet like overripe fruit, had a double association for my grandfather. The first with the famine, with the dying, with the collection of corpses, and the second with love. One association, as it happened, leading to the other. 4. For some reason, the starving thought that they would be better off in Hanoi. But once in the city, they discovered that there was nothing to do but complete the destiny that had been ordained a year ago by the typhoons that devastated the rice crop. Or earlier, when the Imperial Japanese Army occupied French Indochina. Or even earlier than that, when the French Third Republic established its colonial administration over its new territories in Tonkin, or, and so on. My grandfather had preceded this influx of the famished by a few months when he left home with Min Nao Sen. It made all the difference. They arrived in a city buzzing with anticipation of the war's end. All around the world, the Axis powers were being pushed back. The Americans had landed in the Philippines. Paris had been liberated. No one knew what authority the isolated colonial administration still had. The city's working assumption was that the French would soon be gone. The only question was who would replace them. Min Nao Sen favoured pushing on to the limestone caves at Bac Bo on the Chinese border, where the real revolution was being planned. On the way, they could join the peasants marching on rice silos. At that time, the hunger in the countryside was still only a rumour in the city. But my grandfather thought that Hanoi was the place to be. Soon he thought they would be tearing down statues in the capital. He wanted to be there to see it when it happened, and to make sure the replacements were Vietnamese, not Japanese. So the brothers made a pact. Min Nao Sen would join the liberation, while my grandfather would stay in Hanoi, making contacts, getting ready. Then, when the revolution came, they would meet again. 5. The famine arrived in the capital before the revolution. No time to contact the clandestine networks, to infiltrate the colonial administration, to get ready for his brother's triumphant return. Time only to find work, to feed himself while others starved. The municipality was hiring corpse collectors, paid per body. So my grandfather spent his days in the French Quarter, where the starving were making their way from gated household to beg for scraps, and more often than not, dying there too. Those walled gardens were crowned by white and yellow flowers. Thus my grandfather came to associate his work with the scent of frangipanis.
André, I thought I would start with a personal anecdote, if that's okay. So I was at the chemist the other day for shampoo, and I stumbled upon the shampoo that my family used when I was growing up in the 80s in Texas, a shampoo that had been discontinued. At least I think, I don't know, I haven't seen it in 25 years, and suddenly it's in front of me. And I instinctively reached for it, and then froze with my hand on the bottle for a moment, maybe two, before turning and picking up the bottle I'd actually come for, and then leaving. So a little bit of background. I lost both my parents in between my mid to late 30s. And I've just entered into that period of the year, about a 3-month period of the year, where in fairly rapid succession I mark their birthdays and their death anniversaries. It's kind of an emotionally charged part of the year for me. And as I was driving home from the chemist, I realized that I had instinctively gone to open and smell that shampoo, and stopped myself from doing that because I realized, or I didn't realize, but I knew, that I was not emotionally prepared to be transported in that way, standing there as I was in the chemist, that I was not ready to set out as I would have inevitably done in search of lost time. And I'm struck by these kind of Proustian moments throughout your book, because smell for you is also, as you put it, like a bridge across the chasm. This chasm that is temporal and geographic, but also intergenerational and, in a sense, transnational. So your grandfather is transported, or was transported, back to Hanoi of the 1940s. And it's multiple layered associations, love, famine. But it's also your bridge back into that memory, which isn't actually yours, but that you're claiming for yourself, and that you're also, later in the novel, passing on to your children. Like there's the letter that you write to Edith in which you're almost willing her to remember Hanoi through the smell of frangipani and freshly cut peaches, and Paris through the smell of your grandmother's foie gras and her many ointments. And so I'm wondering how that works. I want you to walk us through the sort of sensorial layers of your memory work, and like how much of an experience of place for you, the cities that you're talking about, but also home, which is much more immaterial, right? How much of that is bound with the sensorial and smell in particular?
Thank you for sharing that anecdote. It makes me want to kind of reel off into other tangents, but I'll try and get back to the question. Although first
You can take it in whatever direction you like, actually.
That my grandmother, who just recently passed away, she would wash whenever we would visit with the kids. She would my children. She would wash their clothes with this very particular detergent, which was very strong. Had this very strong floral smell, which is both very evocative, and it also really annoyed my partner because she really didn't like how strongly their children's clothes would sort of smell of this particular detergent for sort of weeks afterwards. You couldn't get rid of it. But in light of your story now, it kind of gives that a slightly different twist for me. I think the key to your question is in that term memory work. So it was work in that, and the sleight of hand in the novel is to present smell or taste or sound as these sort of, as you put it, Proustian moments, that things that sort of erupts out of the words and evoke a place or a memory. But it's all false, right? In the sense that I had to work at it and place it. So, and so the concrete example is the frangipanis. That's my memory. It's my memory of walking through the French Quarter, not really knowing what I was doing. I had sort of the fragments of my grandparents' story in my head, sort of looking at this house thinking, this could be the house that my grandmother grew up in. I'll take a photo of it. I can't get inside there. I sort of don't really have any access to the extraordinary Hanoi that they described to me. But there was, frangipani tree. And so then later, years later, when I was trying to write about that place and that house, that was my, I was using that sense for myself, right? And then, the sleight of hand was then to give that to the grandfather.
I see.
But I think that's sort of it does sort of show something about how, at least for me, I went about writing this book. It's this series of transpositions from the self, and it's sort of inevitable that you kind of take what is evocative for yourself and you spin it out, and then hopefully it's not entirely sort of self-centered or solipsistic, because it does latch onto something real that was remembered by someone else. But it is this work. It's sort of this labour of trying to stitch things that didn't actually go together. So, yeah.
Well, I have more questions for you, but I'll save them for
Okay,
later.
sure. So this next passage takes us to Cambridge, which is where the narrator is. So the present day action of the novel occurs in Cambridge. The narrator is studying there, having given up on trying to write his grandparents' story. He's decided, I'll go back to studying. And so in this scene, the narrator's just given his daughter a bath and put her to bed. And now he's supposed to be studying law. I'm supposed to be reading about the Hart-Radbrook debate. Are there any necessary connections between law and morality? It is a question of analytical precision. I'm supposed to strip away everything I know about the world and see whether the two concepts are connected as a matter of logic. But I wonder whether I have the cognitive firepower to do this sort of thing, whether I once did but have now lost it, to hold a concept and turn it around, examining it from different angles to see how the light of other ideas appears on its revolving surface. Instead, I think about my experiences as a lawyer, a critical misstep for a legal philosopher to slip from theory into practice, and of one client in particular, M, an Iraqi refugee with a long scar from his mouth to his left eye, who had come to Australia as an 8-year-old boy in the late 90s. His parents had divorced soon after, and he didn't much like school. He fell in with the wrong crowd, and his teenage years descended into a series of minor offences: cannabis possession, shoplifting, drink driving. Then in his early 20s, on a night out at the casino, he punched another young man who fell to the pavement. As the young man lay on the ground, M raised his right foot, wearing a size 10 Blundstone work boot, and stomped down on the man's face. One witness said she had heard the cracking of bones from 10 metres away. M pleaded guilty to assault causing grievous bodily harm and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. That was all before he'd become my client. I first met him in the windowless interview room when he was released on parole. The day he got out, he said they handed him a letter from immigration, which said that the minister was thinking about cancelling his refugee visa on character grounds. M had never thought about getting Australian citizenship. It had never occurred to him, and his parents didn't think much about those kinds of things. Now immigration wanted to send him back to Iraq. I don't know anything about the place, he told me, his knee bouncing so hard that our cheap floor rocked along with him. I can barely speak Arabic, he said. I've got a kid here too. What's going to happen to her? He had tattoos down both arms and wore a large gold crucifix over his t-shirt. I converted, he said, when I was inside. The guy who came and spoke to us, the prison had an anger management and violence prevention program, often staffed by Christians. He was, and no Muslim ever helped me, so. Over the next few days, I prepared a submission for the minister. I wrote 50 pages about M's history, how his family had got out after M's uncle had been disappeared, how M had trauma counselling throughout high school, how his parents had divorced after a long period of domestic violence, how he'd completed 3 behavioural programs in prison, all with very promising feedback from the instructors, how M had been remorseful about his actions, something acknowledged by the sentencing judge, how his daughter, an Australian citizen, would grow up without a father if M was deported. I attached letters from a priest, from M's current employer, from the mother of his daughter. The minister's response was perfunctory and formulaic. He'd considered the best interests of M's Australian daughter. He'd considered the advice that M's prospects of rehabilitation were good to excellent. He'd considered the fact that M no longer knew anyone in Iraq, that his prospects there were less than promising. Nevertheless, the minister was persuaded that M posed an unacceptable risk to the Australian community. I had read these lines dozens of times before, copy and pasted from one rejection to another by a 20-something staffer, to be presented to the minister for his signature. The last time I spoke to M, he was in the detention centre on Christmas Island. By then, we'd gone through all available appeals, and now he was just waiting for the knock on his door, when he would be given 15 minutes to pack his things, before getting on the plane where he would sit, handcuffed, flanked by 2 Serco security guards, first to Dubai, and then on to Baghdad.
Hi.
Yeah.
It's appropriate, isn't it, that in the part of this, this is a little extract from the bit of your novel when you're in Cambridge, you're writing your law thesis, you're worrying about legal theory, and so here am I, the law professor, to try and, get you to say a little bit more about actually the legal theory aspect of this. And like any good law professor, having told you to read a certain passage, I'm now going to interrogate you on another passage. That's the main trick that we law professors have, read pages 1 to 20. Okay, now let's turn to page 25. Who's read that? Because the thing that I found the whole thing wonderful, obviously, and painfully melancholy. I don't know if you think that's a fair characterisation of it. I found it, beautiful and moving, but quite hard to read somewhere, and possibly knowing you also made it a little hard to read because there seemed to be this unresolved sense of yourself, your past, where you were, a kind of, not exactly a loss, but a kind of frustration, a kind of exile, something like that. I don't know if you think that's fair.
No, I think that's exactly right. Exile is and that sense of not quite belonging.
Yeah, that's right. And I we could talk about Levinas, and we could talk about that idea of the kind of the moral responsibility of exile, that rather than thinking of being home as being the great virtue, that being in exile is a kind of moral virtue, an ethical kind of position. And I think you're kind of performing that, but it's not an easy place to be in, and I felt that. But in this little quote this bit that you've just read, you're talking about this fundamental debate in legal theory, the Hart-Radbrook debate, which happens after the Second World War, when Hart says, words just mean what they mean. There's no necessary moral content to any word. It can be a good thing, it can be a bad. Laws are like knives. And you can use knives to cut people, to assault people, or you can use them to make food, or you can use them to heal the sick. Doesn't mean anything in particular. And Radbrook, coming from the history of Nazi Germany, says no. There's a sort of a necessary moral content to the words that we use in relation to law, that they have this kind of aura around them, a sense, so that even if we use, say, a word like table, we can't explain what we mean by table without thinking about what makes the table right, what makes the table good, what makes it virtuous in some ways, and that this virtue is kind of intrinsic to the ways in which we try and explain things, this connection to some underlying purpose, not just some instrumental purpose. And I think that your story that you then go on, contrasts like the underlying purpose that there might be to do with, character and expulsion and all of those kinds of things, and the kind of instrumental way in which the law seems to kind of ride roughshod over that. And, in the context of Nazi Germany and the post-war years, that debate was incredibly important. I think it still is, incredibly fraught. What I wanted to take you to was kind of the next page in your book, where you talk about Radbrook's story. So Radbrook is famous for holding to this positivist, objectivist, neutral belief of law, losing his job to the Nazis in 1933, and then after the war, going back and saying, we were wrong. We were wrong in letting the lawyers off the hook. We were wrong in not holding law to higher standards than what particular words might, in a kind of dictionary sense, mean. And what you contribute to that, I found really moving and interesting, which is that Radbrook's own life was a life of suffering. He lost his job in 1933. His daughter was writing a thesis. She died. He lost his two children during the war. And then he tried to write, kind of a book for his family after the war. In the middle of the war, and this is the bit that I found most touching, in the middle of the war, he leaves his job as a lawyer, his work as a lawyer, and he tries to finish his daughter's unfinished thesis. So, and then you ask this little question, which is, what if that posthumous thesis and his own Kleine Rechte Brevier were not the extent of Radbrook's mourning? What if we were to think of all of his post-war work, the attack on positivism and the debate with Hart? What if all that was not a scholarly engagement but rather a way of honouring the dead? So that's really, I just want to say, get you to say a little bit more about that, because I think you're right that to think of the language of law as a kind of mourning, a way of not just recognising the moral content of words, but its intimate connection to particular histories, to particular moments, to travesties, to shame, to guilt, seems to do something quite different than what Hart wants to do.
I think there's something, there's something very seductive about the idea. Like that, I want that to be true. I want that to be possible, that writing, particularly say writing about law or writing laws, could be a way to honour the dead, that it could be a way to hold oneself in that sort of ethical position. And at the same time, I do that there's also, I also refer to Hart's response of that sort of places the lawyer or the law professor on too high a pedestal. We're not that powerful. And I think it's actually the oscillation between the two, which it sort of runs throughout the book, is at some points the narrator thinks, by writing this down, I'm doing something for the dead, and at other points he thinks that's entirely hubristic. And I think, I guess, to go back to your sense of the melancholy, I guess it's because he can't resolve that gives that sense of melancholy. If he could sort of fully believe in the project of redemption, then it would then be a redemptive and hopeful novel. Because he can't quite believe that. That's sort of, I think that's the note of.
I mean, in a recent work about Hart, Radbrook and Fuller, Julian Echabe talks about how words have a kind of force field of associations with them, that they are not just kind of signifiers of a particular object, but ways which, and actually that quote that you read just before about the frangipani is an example of the way in which that lives in the world, that the frangipani is not just a flower, it's a force field for associations. And I think, one argument is that all words with some moral purpose in them, like words related to law, are going to be force fields for associations. And if we don't take account of that, those associations, something terrible is going to happen.
Right. So, and that's why. So there's the melancholy of not being quite sure if the words can, if they still have the magic, right? But then, but they clearly do have an aura, and they do have a magic. So I think that's why
the melancholy is an awareness of the associations of words and memories, and also an awareness of the failure of those associations at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess, and this sort of links up to Leslie's question about, I guess, the senses and the memory work is, it's never fully under control. And I guess that's, so the idea that the memory work could be finally redemptive would be that you could marshal the aura of words or of law and be fully in control of their consequences, but you can't be. And I think for me, the process of writing this book and publishing has been one of the more interesting things for me, has been realizing what I've actually done is to put this book out and lose all control, because people come to me with all sorts of associations and readings, some that I resonate with and others that seem quite far away. And so that's,
I think, just one last, and really it's an aside, and I'll make it very quick, which is that I've been thinking about this a lot today, not just because I was going to talk to you, but because I was reading the judgment in the ACT Supreme Court about the McBride case. And without getting too deep into the whole, into the weeds of that, and I've only read that judgment once or twice, the judge, in saying that there was no official duty on the behalf of the whistleblower other than following orders, goes a very long way in making very strong statements that the duty of a soldier is all about discipline, and it's about control, and it's about doing what you're told, and there are all these quotes from previous cases, and the word duty has no meaning outside of those expectations, because that's what soldiers are and that's what we do. And that seemed to be so deaf, particularly in relation to Hart, Radbrook and the Nazi experience and the Nuremberg trials, completely deaf to the associations and the memories. It seems to so fail in any kind of duty of atonement in relation to those travesties of law in the past that I found it, to put it mildly, puzzling, and to put it more harshly, shocking, that one could use words without an awareness of what it is one is saying when one is using those words, what is evoking when one is using those words.
And perhaps an example of that has, I guess I've been puzzling over, grappling with words like "you're welcome" here in Australia, which is sort of metaphorically words that were spoken to my mother, right, saying, "You're a refugee, you're welcome." And the reason that I find that, so I've been puzzling over that, is recently I was speaking at an event and was talking about how the novel is this sort of, I guess, a meditation on the feeling of not quite belonging here in Australia. And a person came up to me, a white Australian, and said, "I just want you to know that we've always welcomed you." And for me, the amazing thing was the we and the welcome, all the things that were associated with that, the ease of it, I suppose. That first I was struck by the fact that I don't feel like I have access to that we and that welcome. It's not readily accessible to me, but also it's not uncomplicated by colonial history. And I think that's, the seeming simplicity of that gesture is actually quite complicated here on stolen land, right? True.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. So I was just going to end, I guess, with a reading from the end of the book. The narrator's writing a letter to his infant daughter. Dear Edith, your mother often says that my letters to her were written for myself. Not that I've written her a real letter in years. Now, if I'm away, as I was when you were a month old, I send photos of my breakfast and she sends back photos of you asleep in our bed. I send photos of the frangipanis in the car park of the Broome Motel where I'm staying, and she sends me a short video of a woman stealing pot plants from the mall in Footscray. I text her to complain about all the shops in Perth being closed after 5, and she sends me a link to a review in the London Review of Books. It goes back and forth like that when we're away from each other now, all day and into the night. It was different when I was younger, before you were born. When I was living in Hanoi, I sent her handwritten letters in which I got carried away. When I got home, she said that the letters were nice, that some of the images in them had even been beautiful, but that the words hadn't been written for her. Which is to say that I got carried away in my last letter to you. So, to put it in simpler terms, the ground beneath us is not firm. Not here in Cambridge, which, just like Hanoi, is reclaimed swampland. Here it was monks and scholars who clawed back territory from the fen to build a university, destroying in the process an indigenous culture. From Humsa to Cambridge to Footscray. For all their differences, you'll find that all these places are sinking back into the mud in one way or another. I mean that none of these places can be home. They could only become home through a forgetting so total that it would be a kind of amnesia. I doubt that you will be drawn to Cambridge or to Humsa anyway. Perhaps you will be tempted to think of Footscray or Melbourne or Australia as home. True. Day to day, the ground there can seem firm enough, concreted all over as it is. And concrete does help with forgetting. No doubt you know many of these amnesiacs who can live on stolen land without any anxiety. Perhaps you are even envious of them and wish your parents had just let you be. After all, what kind of parents wouldn't want the best for their children? And what could be better than a home? Sorry, I don't mean to be so cynical. Of course, I want you to be happy. And with that must come a place to be. Look, I don't think you will spend every day tortured by this. I certainly am not. Most days I am no different to the other amnesiacs. I have to make a concerted effort to rouse myself to care. Everything about the world around encourages us to be numb, and that is not new. One of the reasons I wanted you to know about your paternal great-grandparents, your ombako, is that they struggled against the numbness. They tried to feel things, to live. What I want to say to you is this. Even if you do not take up that struggle yourself, there will be times when your feelings will be roused. You more than some of your classmates, whose whiteness protects them. Sometimes you will be reminded, quite involuntarily, about what kind of place this is, and I want you to be ready. You might see, for instance, an old pub overlooking the train tracks in Footscray, and find on its side faded white letters spelling out ANA, Australian Natives Association Friendly Society. Then, on a visit to the Immigration Museum, you'll see that natives does not mean what you thought it did. You'll see an aluminium and brass medal commissioned in 1910 by the ANA, and on the middle an outline of Australia with the inscription White Australia, and around that a brass circle inscribed Australia for the Australians. Maybe the closest place we have to a home is Paris. I don't mean the Paris of the Champs-Élysées, or the Paris of Montmartre or the Sorbonne, nor even the Paris that Edward Said described as a capital famous for cosmopolitan exiles. I mean the other city that Said also described, the one where unknown men and women spent years of miserable loneliness. Vietnamese, Algerians, Cambodians, Lebanese, Senegalese, Peruvians. That is, the Paris that is not really Paris at all, but the banlieue like the one where your ombako lived with their eldest daughter in a too-small apartment. The apartment where your ombako told me about their many houses. Sometimes I thought that the telling might itself be a home. For a long time I dreamed that I could take those stories and write a home for you. A place that was yours, a country to which you could say you belong. That I would be able to give you a book and say, here is where your ancestors are buried. Here are your roots. But the past is not a home. Your ombako tried to tell me that. I did not understand what he meant at the time. But looking back over my notes from our conversations, I found that he had once read out a passage to me, written by a 12th century monk from Saxony, Hugo of St. Victor. It is therefore a source of great virtue for the practiced mind to learn, bit by bit, first to change about invisible and transitory things, so that afterwards it may be able to leave them behind altogether. The man who finds his homeland sweet is still a tender beginner. He to whom every soil is as his native one is already strong. But he is perfect to whom the entire world is as a foreign land. The tender soul has fixed his love on one spot in the world. The strong man has extended his love to all places. The perfect man has extinguished his. In my notes, after faithfully transcribing the passage, I had appended my own annotation. ? I see now that the same question marks is repeated throughout my notebooks, recording my conversations with your omko, most often following some remark about Catholic theology. And it is only by following the thread of my own incomprehension that I begin to piece together what he meant. He often spoke of the Societas Peregrinus, or the Peregrine Society, a Catholic lay association for whom he served as secretary for some years in the late 90s and early 2000s. The society organises pilgrimages, more like walking tours really, through southern France, Spain and North Africa. The peregrines, as members of the society are known, wander in silence through these arid interior landscapes that sit just beyond the Mediterranean coast, only speaking after sunset at the pensions where they stay the nights. Before he got too old, that is how your Omgor spent his time, organising the itineraries, corresponding with peregrines, and selecting the readings for their nightly discussion groups. Well, that is not strictly true. For a long time, that is what I wanted to believe. I don't know why, as if his suffering had not already been enough without some biblical wanderings through deserts. Truth is, they didn't really walk. The Societas Peregrinus is a society of fantasists. Their pilgrimages take place entirely on the phone. The only desert they've crossed is the one Milan Kundera called the desert of organised forgetting. In his stories of exiles desperately trying to resist erasure, Kundera showed just how much can be at stake in a world where official memory is to be the only memory, every intimacy to be forgotten, and every countervailing fact to be erased. Notebooks from an old love affair can be worth dying for, and an undoctored photo can be revolutionary. But his characters are all heroes or anti-heroes. At any rate, they're individuals. And one cannot cross the desert on one's own. That is something the Peregrines got right, even if it all started off as a joke, as a way of getting your Omgor to speak after he got back from prison. But the thing is, it worked. It got him talking. It got him imagining. And then it spread. Other people wanted to imagine themselves walking too. Actual exiles like your Omgor, and then, eventually, those who simply felt excited in one way or another. And maybe that is enough, the wanting to walk together. I'll leave it there.